I'm Sam Eckmann of Gold Derby. With me is Bartlett Sher, the director, producer of the Emmy-nominated film Oslo. And Bart, you also directed the Tony-winning Best Play of this on Broadway, but I understand you actually are sort of responsible for the entire gestation of this project because you introduced the real-life Mona and Taya to the writer, J.T. Rogers. So I'm wondering if you can just walk us through
Yeah.
what was that process? How did that happen?
Well, it's quite a sweet story, and it's maybe an incredibly New York kind of story. My daughter's best friend in second grade was named Emma Rod Larson, and she was the daughter of Taya Rod Larson and Mona Ewell, who are essentially the two primary figures in Oslo. And I met them and they would hang out. And so I would go to soccer matches and they would tell me incredible stories about Middle East peace. I mean, I'd known about the Oslo Accords. I knew they were significant in that process, but the whole thing was quite charged and the stories were so incredible. And I thought, this is really interesting. So I introduced Taya to JT Rogers, and JT said, yeah, I think there's a play here. And we started making a play. It took a couple of years and like workshops, the things you do on Broadway. And we actually started it in the small theater at Lincoln Center downstairs and then moved upstairs. So it kind of just kept getting bigger and bigger.
Yeah. And most of your directorial work is in the theater. You're a Tony winner. And I'm just curious, what was it specifically about Oslo that really made you say, I want to jump into film and make this into a film?
Mark Platt, who is one of our producers, had always said to me he wanted to make a film with me. He would tell me that he saw in my theater work a kind of cinematic quality and had always wanted to find something we could work on together. When he first came to see Oslo, he immediately said, this should be a movie. And so from the very beginning, he was instrumental in tracking where we were and seeing how it went. And then strangely, I don't know why. I had been asked about movies before and other things, but I never really felt like it was the right thing. But in the case of Oslo, I could see what movie could be made. So I was like, yeah, let's do that.
And there's I mean, plenty of differences, obviously, because there's a different medium. But I remember the play on Broadway running close to 3 hours, and this film is just under 2. In the adaptation process, was there anything that you really, that was hard to let go of, that you were like, oh, I wish this could all fit in? What was that process like?
Yeah, film is theater is not a first-person medium. Okay, I mean, it's rarely that I went to blah and then I did blah. It just doesn't work that well. Because it's a kind of single image and I'm selecting what I'm seeing in the image. Film is a deeply first-person medium. You can really load it up behind a single person and track them. So the first step that we took was shifting the play from being the story told by this couple to being almost exclusively being Mona Ewell's story, and loaded up behind her. And luckily we had Ruth Wilson to help because she's so good at kind of guiding me through that. So we reshaped the script to focus on Mona's and entered it differently, everything. So I don't feel like I miss things. I feel like we have the right things in the film and we had more things. What's weird about a play is in play I can say, oh, and then I went to blah and move the chair 4 feet and everybody sits down differently and I'm now in a new country. If I'm going to do that in a film, and the one thing I would say about films that like blew my mind were like car meetings. You got to sit and have a long meeting about all the different kinds of cars. And it's a much more literal thing. It's long drives up to the manor house and then getting out of the car and then walking up the stairs. Those are things you don't worry about in the theater. So I had to just kind of rethink my way of tracking it. But I never felt like in the course of that I ever, one was complete in and of itself, as was the other. And I lost, the more things I would lose from one to the other, the more they became their own individual child. And I loved them both equally.
Yeah, it does have a different, the focus has shifted more towards Mona. I think one of maybe my favorite additions to the film is that opening flashback
Yeah,
to her experience in Gaza. It just completely sets a new tone.
yeah.
Why was it important to you to have that element, that piece at the start of the film?
That's referred to about 20 minutes into the play, as it tells the story of what made them want to go into this, and the story of these two boys and this experience they had in Gaza is, to me, what was important was telling a story of, like, it's always interesting what compels somebody to public service or to actually do really difficult things. And instead, I didn't see this as a traumatic event, although when you watch it, it feels traumatic. I felt like it was the thing that what Mona saw called her to seek uh, service and to seek justice somehow, and to kind of try to make things right. And it gave a kind of moral structure and predicament to the film. And that's why we put a lot of time into it. Janusz filmed it differently. We did everything around the flashback differently, and then built it all the way through the film, so that you always kept in mind not only the events, but the larger impact of the events. It's just true that you can solve disputes through the barrel of a gun, or you can sit down and talk. And this film puts together that kind of question, which is better.
The other thing that struck me, transitioning from stage to screen, is there's almost a claustrophobic element to some of the things, because they are in these rooms for so much of the story, doing these back channel negotiations, and the rooms sort of become a character themselves in the
Yeah.
film. That image of the door, keeps coming up in a very powerful,
Yeah.
profound way. How did you take advantage of shooting in those spaces?
Um, I kind of had to, like, I mean, I'll make all my references are going to go back to theater. In the theater space, it was like one open space with one giant door. Okay, so I was making the metaphoric statement in that way. In the case of the film, you do these weird things in films, and I'm sure other people talk about them better than I do. But you go and you do a location scout, and you find a space. And we found this amazing place called Kachina outside Prague, and it had all of the different rooms. It had the place they could meet together. It had where they could eat. And we built a kind of topography in the same way I would with a stage space, of going from room to room, built, uh, hinged on the kind of metaphor of this door. Like, what does it mean to go inside and talk, and what does it mean to be on the outside? And I really looked for a place which could have the geography, which I could follow it through the film. And that just took a lot of time, and I had a great production designer, Michael Carlin, to kind of help with that. So
Yeah. The other great thing is you have the Israelis and Palestinians are played by actors of that region.
yeah.
And I'm curious, what was it like, having their perspective on set and during this process?
um, well, I have to say, the one great thing about making movies, I was so privileged to have such an extraordinary international group of actors. And to have Ruth Wilson and Andrew Scott, who are already so great, but also actors from Finland and from the Middle East. And I spent a lot of time working with Leslie Feldman, our casting director, looking for these people, and kind of was hoping to really honestly make an all-star team from the Middle Eastern actors, and particularly Palestinian and Israelis. But what's funny is, in rehearsal, they would tell stories. The great thing is they're all in the theater, right? And they've all worked together. So they all know each other. So their experience as artists is actually kind of the biggest hope of what Oslo does. They all know each other already. They all talk. They're all very honest with each other. They're very tough on each other. They're very thorough. And so we had this kind of double thing going on at the same time. We had a process in which you'd actually have the experience of trying to work out this solution in 1992, and you'd have the same human experience going on between these actors who really truly knew and loved each other, challenged each other at the same time. So it was great. And for me, as an artist coming from the United States, they constantly were teaching me,
Hmm.
and very honestly and very forthrightly. And I think that made for a better movie.
Yeah. And I think, excuse me, that a lot of your casting for those roles was virtual due to the
Yeah.
pandemic, which we're all living in our virtual screens now. Um, how did that, it's an international story and it's a pretty epic story. So how did the pandemic sort of affect your filming process?
Oh my God. Well, um, enormously on every level. First of all, we decided to do it, and so I spent a lot of time. I took my family up to like a cabin in Vermont where a friend let us use it, and I spent all this time in this weird cabin talking to people in the Middle East, which was its own weird experience and fun experience in a way. Um, Met with them, and then the actual process of going to Prague and sort of locking down and working. I think it was my first film, so I imagined that you would work during the day and talk and maybe even rehearse and then have dinner afterwards and talk and build a big beautiful community. But in COVID, it doesn't work that way, because what happens is you do get very close and you work hard, but then the minute you're done with the work, everybody is isolated and put in their separate universes and stop. And we did have struggles with COVID, but it just kind of hung over the experience completely because all of us were out of our home countries. We were all in Prague and we were all kind of in these little isolated pods, and everyone would show up on the set and peel the masks off and then like talk to each other and then go back. And so it was a little bit like some crazy, I'm sure the movie will be made later, of making a movie during COVID, but it is definitely not human in the same way. So you learn to cope and compensate through that. And everybody was great, and incredibly um, strong, including the crews. And you're asking people to take risks. You would if you were, any director is asking their artists to risk and, give us your all, but not necessarily in the middle of a pandemic where you added another level of risk to that. So that created strangely, a kind of camaraderie and devotion that I don't think we would have had otherwise.
Yeah, some physical risk in terms of
Yes.
different
Yeah.
from emotional risk.
Yeah.
Having this film actually released, just by the nature of the world at a time where there was sort of this renewed tension between Palestine and Israel.
Yeah.
And from your perspective, did you sort of witness the story landing differently with audiences as a result of that?
That's an excellent question. I think what's important for audiences to know is that Oslo is 1992 and was a particular moment in which the palace, unusually following the fall of the Berlin Wall and all these other changes happening, where it seemed like incredible things could happen. And that enormous risks were taken to begin a process. But Oslo was only meant to be the beginning. And then there was meant to be more negotiations that followed that. So when the film came out, we were sitting in the kind of hope and idealism of Oslo against the truth of where it went over the next 25 years. And I think it's important for audiences to see it as a call to dialogue, but not as a solution necessarily. The concerns and incredible complexities of where the Palestinian people are now and the human rights questions are still deeply profound. And the way in which Israel is struggling as a country with its leadership and where it is, those questions are now very, very different than they were then. But the premise that they should find a way to talk to each other and find a way to agree is still the same. Opening it during that was complex and very intense for everybody and really stressful, just because you didn't want to give people the impression that we were opening something that was there to give them some solution. We were only doing a history play. And interestingly, since it's opened, and actually even since the Emmy nominations, it was very beautifully covered in Israel. They're very excited about it. I think in the Arab world, it's been popular, and especially because of Salim Dow's performance and seeing a character like Abu Allah represent the Palestinian people at the time. Having it as a document for the history is important. So I think its overall impact as a film is still unfolding and still finding its way. And I think it's having a small but significant uh, participation in the conversation.
Yeah. And I imagine you having spent so much time with it over these years and in so many different iterations, that its impact on you has sort of shifted. What would you say is sort of the most important thing that this process and this story has taught you?
Well, yeah, well, Oslo is an odd piece because when we first did it, it was like 2016, 17, and Trump was just being elected. So anybody who came to see it only thought the piece was about Republicans and Democrats. Okay. When we did it at the National Theatre in England, they, of course, were very compelled by the story of the Palestinians, and it's a very important issue there. But they only kept talking about Brexit and places where people are enormously polarized and separated. So strangely, and maybe for a good reason, when the film came out, it was really about Palestinians and Israelis. It was really about what it is. And it was resonating in the world for that struggle. I do think it still has a lot to say about polarization and about the incredibly difficult circumstances we're finding ourselves in the United States with people not talking to each other. So that part is still resonant, but I'd set out to really talk about a difficult question, which was Israel and Palestine. And I think we have a balanced and fair assessment of that question at a particular time in history.
Well, before I let you go, I have to ask, because just even talking to you brings back a lot of good Broadway memories from shows
Yes,
I've
sure.
seen, and we're finally, after this a very long intermission, getting ready to reopen here in New York. Has the shutdown made you sort of think about, like, are you looking at projects to come back? And if so, has the shutdown sort of influenced what you're drawn to and what kind of stories you want to tell?
Well, when the shutdown happened, I had six shows of mine close in 1 week. Okay, so my first task, personal task, is to remount and sort of get these shows back up and running, get people back to work. And that's going to take over a couple of months of time to do that. I was in the middle of doing this beautiful chamber opera at Lincoln Center Theater in the same space where we started Oslo, called Intimate Apparel, based on Lynn Nottage's play, with Ricky and Gordon. And it was an incredible experience, and I can't wait for it to open because it still hasn't opened. I will say uh, that I'm excited for Broadway's return because I think the Broadway that we're going to have, and I think that the American theater we're going to have, is going to be profoundly changed. I know that I'm working differently as I prepare my casts, as I think about power structures within the work, as I think about who we are in it, and where voices are. I think we've all been compelled to have a very deep exploration of those questions, and it's now really time to show whether we understand how much we can and should change. And there's some exciting projects opening on Broadway, like Passover, which is coming. And I think it's going to be an extraordinary time in the next 10 years on Broadway, and it's going to really explode in ways that we could never have imagined had there not been a pandemic. So I'm incredibly excited and hopeful about it, and I do think there's going to be a lot of new faces and a lot of great work, and I can't wait for the Tonys to actually happen, as you know. And I think it could be a really important time ahead.
Well, best of luck getting all those shows back up and running. We can't wait to see those and everything else you do. So thank you so much, everyone out there who's watching. Subscribe to Gold Derby. Make sure to keep up to date with us throughout Emmy season. And Bart, thank you again. Congrats on the Emmy nomination.
Great. Thanks, Sam.